Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on F. Scott Fitzgerald's 124th birthday for Paradise Revisited, the virtual version of the annual McDermott Lecture featuring Philip McGowan, editor of the new Oxford University Press edition of This Side of Paradise. Today's program is sponsored by Baird, an employee-owned wealth management, capital markets, asset management, and private equity firm. I'm Elaine Hopkins, Director of Programs and Services for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, an independent nonprofit organization that acts as a catalyst for libraries to strengthen and inspire their communities. As we get started this afternoon, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land from which we broadcast today on the St. Paul side of things. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. I also want to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are also the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. At the beginning of this year, which seems like a long time ago, the nonprofit organization Fitzgerald in St. Paul became part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. The Friends assumed stewardship of F. Scott Fitzgerald's legacy through continued programming that celebrates the life and literature of the revered author and inspires people to reflect on both his historical and contemporary significance. The McDermott Lecture, today's event, is named for Richard P. McDermott, who helped restore Fitzgerald's birthplace at 481 Laurel Avenue, St. Paul, and then lived in the apartment and condo for more than 35 years before passing away in 2012. Fitzgerald in St. Paul was born out of his vision and passion, and the Friends is honored to continue to recognize his work. While we wish that we could be with all of you today in person and that Philip wasn't an ocean away, we are all still in for a treat. After the presentation, we'll open up for questions, so please feel free to put those in the chat. Philip McGowan is the Director of Internationalization in the School of Arts, English, and Languages at Queen's University, Belfast. He's president of the European Association for American Studies and has been a member of the executive board of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society since 2005. He also serves on the Royal Irish Academy for Languages, Literature, Culture, and Communications. In addition to his work as the editor of the Oxford University Press centenary editions of Fitzgerald's fiction, he is the editor of the new Penguin edition of The Great Gatsby with a foreword by Min Jin Lee to be published next year. So welcome, Philip.
Thank you, Elaine. That's very kind. Listening to these introductions, one never knows whether it's actually that they're being talked about, but apparently it is. So I'm just going to share my screen, make sure this all works properly. There. Okay. I think that's me. Okay, thank you very much. It's a real honor and a privilege to be invited to deliver this year's McDermott Lecture to the Friends of St. Paul Public Library. And to those of you joining us with an interest in the life and the works of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'd like to thank a few people before I begin. First off, Stu Wilson, who initially extended the invitation to deliver this lecture, though that was in pre-COVID times, all of which now feel like so long ago. But also Elaine Hopkins, who you just saw on the screen, who has maintained regular email contact since the start of this year, when it became clear that a lecture in person was not going to be possible. And thanks also, you haven't seen him, but he's behind the scenes, David Katz, who is working hard to ensure that the technology works. Fingers crossed, I hope. I'm on the other side of the Atlantic and it is pouring rain here. So let's hope this works. It is extremely disappointing not to be with you in person. I've only been to St. Paul once, which was in 2002 for the 6th International F. Scott Fitzgerald Conference. And I've been really looking forward to being there with you all to celebrate a number of events today and this week. Notably, obviously Fitzgerald's birthday, born in this, well, in that city, 124 years ago today, but also to celebrate the centenary just passed on the 10th of September of the publication of his first short story collection, Philosophers and Philosophers. And I suppose partly the reason that I have been invited to deliver this lecture, the centenary of the publication of his first novel, This Side of Paradise, which occurred on the 26th of March of this year. Given the nature of world events in 2020, I received my own copies of the new Oxford World's Classics edition of This Side of Paradise only last week. There it is. I only got it, but at least I had it in time to be able to prove that it exists. Timing and chance and happenstance play their parts in so much of what we do in this life. And perhaps in 2020, we realize that more than ever, given everything that we have been going through recently. And this is kind of where I want to start with Fitzgerald and This Side of Paradise, and how it came to pass that I somehow was given the honor of editing a centenary edition of the novel for Oxford University Press. Then I want to take these elements of chance and happenstance and timing, most particularly timing, and examine how they influence Fitzgerald's writing of the novel and some of its structuring elements. I'll also draw in briefly Flappers and Philosophers to make some further points about Fitzgerald, fiction, and timing in his 1920 debut texts. Had you said to me on this particular day 2 years ago that we would be having this lecture and the discussion hopefully that will follow, and that I specifically would be the presenter because I had just edited a new edition of This Side of Paradise, I would probably have told you to leave off drinking the cooking sherry. But in 2018, on the 12th of October, I received an email out of the blue from the new editor of Oxford World's Classics, Luciana O'Flaherty. I'm sure Luciana won't mind me quoting from part of it, as it still strikes me as being as random as it does fortunate. She wrote, "I wonder if you could give me some advice if you have time. I'm interested in publishing more Fitzgerald, particularly Tender as the Night. I know the copyright situation is complicated. It's out of copyright here, but not in the US. I believe it's 95 years after first publication in the US. And there may be issues with the copy text. But I'm wondering if it might still be something worth doing for an audience outside America. Or do you feel the current available editions are more than adequate? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And indeed, if there's something else you feel we should be looking at for the series." Any of you who are familiar with email will know that 99% of it is either completely tedious or so totally mundane that they just appear designed to clog up an inbox we never thought we knew with work we'd rather avoid. But this one stood out for so many particular reasons, I think. I was perplexed at the timing, though. A new edition of Tender as the Night at any time is a good idea in my book, but there are other issues and other Fitzgerald texts that I thought maybe deserved some recognition. Luciana's email had arrived at 11:11 in the morning. I had meetings and teaching to keep up with for the rest of the day, but the question of a new edition of Tender ticked away in my mind all afternoon and evening 2 years ago, and I resolved to reply the next morning as positively as I could, though I was keen to point out that we were on the cusp of a series of Fitzgerald centenaries, beginning in 2020 with This Side of Paradise and Flappers and Philosophers. Perhaps, though, it was Luciana who had got her timing right, or I got the timing of my reply just right. She was, thankfully, instantly hooked on the idea of reissuing all of Fitzgerald's novels and story collections to coincide with the rolling series of centenaries between 2020 and what will be 2035, and forwards for The Love of the Last Tycoon in 2040-41. So we've got a lot of celebrating to do the next 2 decades. I hope you're ready for this. Of course, timing or luck are never the primary factors in making these kinds of publishing decisions. Fitzgerald, as we know, sells. He and his works are as marketable today as at any other time in the previous 100 years, arguably more so. So new editions of the 4 completed novels the 4 story collections, and of the unfinished Love of the Last Tycoon was never going to be that hard of a sell. Within a month of our first contact, Luciana had given the green light to assemble a team of editors to take on each of the editions. And on the 19th of January, 2019, I was able to email the full list and a fairly extensive new series proposal to OUP. Timing, of course, was a key consideration. With myself down to edit the new edition of This Side of Paradise, and Kurt Kernot to edit the new edition of Flappers and Philosophers, and the relevant contracts issued in mid-February, we both had exactly 5 months to turn the editions around with new introductions, explanatory notes, a Fitzgerald chronology, and up-to-date suggested reading lists to be able to meet OUP's production schedules. So no pressure there at all. Also no pressure, I felt, that's a lie, that the previous Oxford World's Classics edition in 2009 had been edited by Jackson Breyer, one of the leading scholars of Fitzgerald studies, or that another giant of our field, James L. W. West III, had produced the 1996 Cambridge edition of the novel, in many ways the go-to version of the book. So what could I do to at least, if I could, match these 2 editions by the 2 prominent, indeed field-defining Fitzgerald scholars that we all know? Also, to do it within 5 months during my busiest teaching semester, well, it was still an opportunity too good to resist. It was a chance to go back to a novel that I had not read since my PhD and had, if truth be told, given scant regard since that West Cambridge edition had come out. For the purposes of a new Oxford edition, it meant a quick survey of what Jack Breyer had done with the text. It was quickly evident to me that I could do a bit more work with the explanatory notes for starters, which in some instances spoke to a wholly US-based reading audience. For example, no gloss was given at all of the media mogul William Randolph Hearst. So for readers on this side of the Atlantic, I think we needed to have a little bit more detail on some characters. In other instances, some of Jack's notes needed to be, let's say, retuned, that's be the kind word. A prime example of this was his reference to Lord Edward Carson as, quote, an Irish politician. Edward Carson was the leader of the fledgling Ulster Volunteer Force that opposed Home Rule for all of Ireland, leading to the partition of Ireland in 1921. That particular centenary is obviously very close, round the corner here, and I thought it better to have that kind of inaccuracy amended for a new set of undergraduates and international readers. There was also some translation. If you're familiar with the novel, you know there's a bit in it where there's some Irish is produced phonetically in the letter from Monsignor Darcy to Amory Blaine during World War I. So I thought maybe I could do something with the Irish language stuff there. So maybe chance and happenstance had coincided, and that I was probably the right person to edit this edition after all. Coming to this, I thought, and I usually do think these things, but I usually start at the end and work backwards into something. So I thought I'd look at the notes first and then I'd work back into the text. But the ending of This Side of Paradise, or how this specific novel ends, is of particular importance, and there's been a particular discussion about it for quite a number of years. And Jack Breyer's 2009 edition, closes the novel on a full stop, with Amory's final line, "I know myself," he cried, "but that is all," given a finality, a conclusive summation that I don't think the preceding novel sustains. Amory's last words in the novel are an acknowledgement of the incomplete nature of his education as a personage. His is the same unfinished acknowledgement of incompletion that echoes in Carraway's Close to Gatsby, or of Anthony Patch staring out to sea at the end of The Beautiful and Damned. And also, I think, of Dick Divers drifting between small towns in upstate New York at the close of tender is the night. Amory Blaine, as a character in the Fitzgerald pantheon, is one model for these later Fitzgerald men, uncertain of anything and everything except themselves. The fact that this novel should end on a dash, and there has been extended critical debate about quite when Fitzgerald's dash in the manuscript was altered to a full stop in the print version, and whether or not Fitzgerald approved of the change. And again, here we have to tip our hats to Jim West. The making of This Side of Paradise from 1983 remains the authoritative book on the novel's resolution as well as its evolution. But the fact that this novel should end on a dash is so much more in keeping with Amory's cry at the end. His "that is all" is not a declaration of self-sufficiency, far from it. Instead, the open-ended final line sets off a reverberation that will be carried into the novels that follow This Side of Paradise. There are detectable traces of Amory Blaine and of this debut novel's complex networks of meaning and of definition and redefinition that recur in Fitzgerald's follow-up fictions on the other side of paradise. So, I want to move to looking at a few things that struck me on returning to this novel, and I think it was during my PhD, so that's not that long ago. But when I returned to this novel, a few things did strike me that I kind of made me realize that it's a better novel than I had thought it was, and I kind of felt a bit guilty about that, I think. I had dismissed This Side of Paradise in ways that now I find inexplicable. This Side of Paradise is a novel of men with women. And obviously I'm tipping the nod there to Hemingway. But in Fitzgerald's universe, the women invariably come out on top. It is not a novel of disparate adventures, forward jumps in time, unexplained lacunae, and quite a collection of loose ends. There are contradictions inherent within the structure of This Side of Paradise that no amount of redrafting could have resolved. It is, though, I think, very important to remember that structure remained an issue for F. Scott Fitzgerald throughout his writing career. And we only need to think of the problems that he encountered trying to organize and reorganize and fix basically the drafts of Tender as a Night to see that he never fully overcame the issue quickly. I mentioned time before and the importance of timing and time. And in the novel, I think time is an extraordinarily important element. The importance of it, both for the novel's creation and its outworking, is another main aspect of its interest and success as well. In the years 1917, 1918, as he's drafting the novel, time was proving to be an almost insurmountable obstacle for Fitzgerald if his, what he referred to as consuming ambition to be a writer, was to be realized. And famously, he notes, "I had only 3 months to live." In those days, all infantry officers thought they had only 3 months to live, and I had left no mark on the world. So in addressing this particular gap, and faced with the oblivion that would either come in battle or in the lasting anonymity of being a literary nobody, Fitzgerald began committed work on the text that was referred to then as the Romantic Egotist, when he was not undertaking military training at various camps in the Midwest and the American South. The novel, as it takes shape, and as we have its revised, published version today, is part autobiography, part social commentary, and part cultural history. Though in its earliest incarnations, it is rooted firmly within Fitzgerald's own experience. As he notes himself, "I wrote paragraph after paragraph on a somewhat edited history of me and my imagination." Time in all of its manifestations is a central issue for This Side of Paradise. Whether it was the time pressures Fitzgerald believed himself to be under, or the movements across time that the novel executes, the differences that it charts between prosaic time and poetic time, and between poetic time as well as dramatic time and its different use of genres in the text. Fitzgerald's sort of fluid interspersing of drama with poetry with prose is quite a risky tactic for a debut novel, I think you'll have to agree. We also have the slowing of time as Amory stretches out on the lawns of Princeton, or the conflation of time later during his drunken spree in Manhattan, following his latest abortive romance, this time with Rosalind Connage. We have the consciousness of the different experiences of time for the sentimental as opposed to the romantic individual. We have wartime as opposed to peacetime. And the novel also charts times of innocence and times of experience. This side of paradise is calibrated by these multiple measures of time in a novel lauded on its release as being indisputably of its times. At the heart of it all is Emery Blaine, who self-consciously draws his own attention and the attention of readers to knowing the times, even those that mark the end of relationships. To quote, after his relationship with Rosalind has ended, the Knickerbocker Bar, beamed upon by Maxfield Parrish's jovial, colourful old King Cole, was well crowded. Amory stopped in the entrance and looked at his wristwatch. He wanted particularly to know the time, for something in his mind that catalogued and classified liked to chip things off cleanly. Later, it would satisfy him in a vague way to be able to think that thing ended at exactly 20 minutes after 8 on Thursday, June 10, 1919. Now, going back to the novel and reading this, I was struck as this was a moment where I could actually make some sort of original, maybe, intervention to make an amendment to the stock of critical knowledge about this side of paradise. If you know Jim West's Cambridge edition, Jim is quite clear in that the Knickerbocker Bar and the Knickerbocker Hotel are two very distinct establishments in two particular and different geographical locations. According to West, the Knickerbocker Bar was, quote, a watering hole at Broadway and 38th. And it was here that Maxfield Parrish's mural of old King Cole hung behind its Flemish oak bar. Jim goes on to note that the Knickerbocker closed with the coming of Prohibition. As regards the hotel of the same name, Jim adds that it was located at 42nd and Broadway, and this was where Enrico Caruso lived and entertained. Distinct from the Knickerbocker Bar, he concludes. One of the aspects of the book that fascinates me is this section where Amory is sort of traipsing around Midtown Manhattan getting very drunk. But you can map that Midtown area in 1919-1920 almost completely through Amory and his friends' peripatetic familiarity with the local bars and night spots. In certain facts, Jim is obviously correct. He always usually is. You know, if you want something about Fitzgerald studies, go to Jim West. The Knickerbocker Bar opened in 1906. It was built by John Jacob Astor IV, who died on the HMS Titanic in April 1912. Among the hotel's most famous residents was indeed Enrico Caruso and his family, and this was because the hotel stood in close proximity to the Metropolitan Opera, 3 blocks away. The original Knickerbocker Hotel closed in 1921 and was converted into offices. And just to note, those of you in Manhattan might already know this, a new Knickerbocker Hotel opened on the same site in 2015. But my researches into the New York Times and its review section of hotels suggest that Jim is maybe a little incorrect in claiming that the Knickerbocker Bar was a separate establishment. Indeed, as a New York Times review of the hotel on its opening on the 24th of October 1906 makes clear, the bar of the Knickerbocker Hotel, where the Maxfield Parrish Old King Cole mural was hung behind the bar, was indeed also the Knickerbocker Bar. And in that circled or yellow squared rectangle quote, the lobby on the 42nd Street side was much admired by most of by the host of visitors, and all paused to take a look at the representation of Father Knickerbocker in the entrance hall. Maxfield Parrish's Old King Cole and his Fiddlers Three, the chief decoration of the barroom, attracted much attention. For those interested, though, the painting still exists and can be found in the King Cole bar of the St. Regis Hotel at East 55th Street and 5th Avenue in Manhattan. Cue a kind of exodus now of everyone in Manhattan who had been tuned in, and now they're off to look at this painting if they haven't seen it before. But that's okay, that's fine. So despite the unevenness of the novel's structure and the scores of typographical errors in the first editions, and Fitzgerald, we know, was very well known for his poor spelling, and these were grist to the critical mills of some unimpressed reviewers, Fitzgerald had presented his generation of young American adults with a book that represented their lives and their outlooks for the very first time. Fitzgerald was supplying precisely what he intended to. My idea is always to reach my generation, he noted in the brief and humorous an interview with Mr. Fitzgerald by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which was self-conducted in the spring of 1920. Continuing on this theme, and repeating a line that would appear in Scribner's promotional materials for the American Booksellers Association in 1920, and on the back of the new edition that I've done, Fitzgerald declares famously, "The wise writer, I think, writes for the youth of his own generation, the critic of the next, and the schoolmasters of ever afterward." The immediate reception of the novel, although not universally uncritical, can be mapped in part by the sales figures that Paradise achieved in its first 2 years. Retailing at $1.75, the novel sold out of its initial print run of 3,000 copies in 3 days. Scribner's reprinted this side of Paradise another 8 times in 1920, with a further 3 printings following in 1921, so that a total of 49,075 copies were in circulation by the close of 1921. This, though, didn't mean that much in terms of bestseller sales. It didn't trouble the top 10 performers on the bestseller lists either in 1920 or in 1921. But as a showing for a debut novel, it was certainly more than respectable. It's still the case that during Fitzgerald's lifetime, obviously, because it's not around anymore, but this Side of Paradise was his best-selling novel while he lived. West has argued elsewhere that had Fitzgerald chosen a more commercial publisher, say, rather than Scribner's, he may have benefited from the additional sales that a larger print run could well have generated. And if we look at Fitzgerald's sales in relation to like the big bestsellers of his time, we can see that maybe there is some truth in that. Sinclair Lewis's Main Street from 1920 topped the 1921 bestsellers with 295,000 copies sold that year alone. And it would become the best-selling American novel of the first quarter of the 20th century. When Flappers and Philosophers came along on the 10th of September 1920, it sold well, certainly for a story collection. Within 2 years, there would be 6 printings of the story collection, and it sold a very respectable 15,325 copies, which for a set of 8 stories that had already appeared separately in print was no mean feat. Matthew Brookley notes that the reviews of Flappers and Philosophers were mixed, he says, with some critics finding it a letdown after This Side of Paradise. Fitzgerald's own thoughts on the merits of the collection's strengths might be gauged by how he rated the 8 stories in the copy that he inscribed for H.L. Mencken. And for Mencken's edition or copy, he offered him 3 categories: worth reading, amusing, and trash. Appearing in the last category of trash were Head and Shoulders, The Four Fists, and Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Taking up the whole category of amusing, Fitzgerald places The Offshore Pirate. And in worth reading, he lists 4 other stories: The Ice Palace, The Cut Glass Bowl, Benediction, and Dalrymple Goes Wrong. Brookley notes in some sort of epic grandeur that the last two stories listed here, Benediction and Dalrymple Goes Wrong, are included as worth reading because they had appeared in Mencken's The Smart Set, the first magazine to publish a Fitzgerald story, and that was Babes in the Woods, obviously, in September 1919. It is notable, though, where is it? I have it here somewhere. Yes, Brookley brought out this massive collected Fitzgerald stories in 1989 with Scribner's. It's notable that in this collected edition, that Brookley omits both Benediction and Dalrymple Goes Wrong from the contents. So not all aporia and lacunae within Fitzgerald's career were of his own making. I'm going to come back to the story Benediction in a short while. Whatever the later publishing choices and good fortune related to Fitzgerald's stories, Flappers and Philosophers followed a fairly standard practice of American publishers at the time, and Scribner's was no different. The publication of a short story collection on the heels of a new novel by any author. And Fitzgerald achieved this in 1920, obviously, with the publication first of This Side of Paradise and then Flappers and Philosophers, and again in 1922 with Tales of the Jazz Age following The Beautiful and Damned. A slight delay in 1925 meant that The Great Gatsby was followed in 1926 by All the Sad Young Men. And Tapsit Reveille would appear in 1935, a year after Tender is the Night. But we can see the sort of synchronicity between the publication cycle. For now, I want to go back to Paradise just shortly. Fitzgerald's first novel had established a benchmark against which all of his later fictions would be measured. This Side of Paradise was and remains important because it was the first novel by Fitzgerald, and it was the novel against which critics would classify his later achievements. Whatever its unsatisfactory and uneven moments, without it, we might not have had the Fitzgerald career as it has evolved. Not all of the issues ascribed to the novel are necessarily its or its author's responsibility, however. If we look at the young irony chapter of book 2, so again, I'm kind of asking you to have some familiarity with This Side of Paradise, but it's the bit where Amory has had his kind of summer romance with Eleanor Savage, and then they're kind of splitting up. The young irony chapter of book 2, West has argued, is, quote, the weakest chapter in book 2. It damages the novel and introduces new inconsistencies into Amory's personality, unquote. In Fitzgerald Studies Broadly Defined, Jim West is a titan. There's absolutely no doubt about it, of contemporary scholarship. But I think on this occasion, he misjudges and thus underestimates the importance of this one particular chapter in the novel. Not just for the novel, but for a wider view of Fitzgerald's take on religion and sexual freedom. Indeed, there is a climactic exchange between Eleanor Savage and Amory Blaine that takes place just before she makes an abortive suicide attempt. You might recall she jumps off her horse before it plunges over a cliff. And I think the exchange deserves closer critical attention and indeed more acute critical knowledge. Eleanor Savage is arguably the book's main iconoclast, declaring that there is no God, not even a definite abstract goodness. She is a passionate believer in the atheism with which Amory increasingly engages as the novel progresses. And her character recalls aspects of Beatrice Blaine, Amory's mother, her studied disconnection from religious belief. But for Beatrice, it's more humorous as the book opens. For Eleanor, it's certainly much more serious. More than this, though, slightly earlier in their exchange, Eleanor makes a series of comments about the sexual hypocrisy of the Catholic Church that would not be out of place at the start of the 21st century, never mind the much more morally constrained early 20th century. Skewering both Amory and the church in one go, she rails against the, quote, thousands of scowling priests keeping the degenerate Italians and illiterate Irish repentant with gabble about the 6th and 9th commandments. It's just all cloaks, sentiment, and spiritual rouge and panaceas. Both Jack Breyer and Jim West, in their editions of the novel, note that Eleanor is here referring to the commandments forbidding murder and the bearing of false witness. She's not. This is not the case in the Catholic Church and its liturgical catechism. The 6th and 9th commandments in Catholic religion are prohibitions on adultery and one's coveting of their neighbour's wife. This is crucial in how we understand this particular moment in the novel and assess Eleanor's character as one of the strong women, and they are all strong women, that Fitzgerald creates in this side of paradise. For these words and this argument to come from out of Eleanor's mouth at this point in time is nothing short of devastating. Her critique of the church and of Amory's trace adherence to its compromised morality is a startling moment in a novel that had carefully enfolded a number of Catholic elements and pro-Catholic characters, Monsignor Darcy most obviously, within its earlier movements. Eleanor's rebellion in the face of the church, shaking her fists against an absent God, gives permission to Amory's closing recognition of the new circumstances of a generation releasing itself from the dictums of its predecessors. And famously, he says, "Here was a new generation shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty grey turmoil to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken." In case there might be any sort of doubt about which particular commandments or version of this catechism Fitzgerald might be referring to, he returns to the very same issue in the short story Absolution in 1924. Appearing in the June edition of Mencken's American Mercury magazine, and later collected in All the Sad Young Men in February of 1926, Absolution narrates the intriguing relationship between the 11-year-old boy Rudolf Miller and his local priest, Reverend Adolphus Schwartz. Early in the story's second part, Rudolf Miller is waiting his turn to go to confession. Rudolf Miller knelt in the pew beside the confessional and waited, straining nervously to hear and yet not to hear what was being said within. The fact that the priest was audible alarmed him. His own turn came next, and the 3 or 4 others who waited might listen unscrupulously while he admitted his violations of the 6th and 9th commandments. Rudolf had never committed adultery, nor even coveted his neighbour's wife, but it was the confession of the associate sins that was particularly hard to contemplate. In comparison, he relished the less shameful fallings away. They formed a greyish background, which relieved the ebony mark of sexual offences upon his soul. F. Scott Fitzgerald's willingness to confront the sexual hypocrisy of the Catholic Church and its hierarchy is, it must be admitted, I think, a blistering comment to make in 1920, and again here in modulated form in 1924. And I believe that acknowledging this fact can now allow a reset of some of our approaches to Fitzgerald's work. So this takes me back to Benediction, the short story from Flappers and Philosophers, one of the 4 stories from that collection that Fitzgerald deemed worthy of reading. About the collection overall, I certainly agree with Kirk Kernot in his notes to the new introduction by OUP, that the 8 stories, quote from Kirk, exude a joyousness that a reader probably has to be 21 or 22 to believe is a sustainable outlook or credo in life, unquote. Fitzgerald's willingness to experiment with forms and genres in this side of paradise extends to the stories in Flappers and Philosophers. We get humor, we get social commentary, we get the supernatural, alongside what Kirk Kernot identifies in Dalrymple Goes Wrong as, quote, a satire of civic virtue and business ethics that pulses with post-war cynicism towards hand-me-down values like integrity and the Protestant work ethic. There's also the morality tale of the Four Fists, a story in which learning the hard way about the difference between right and wrong seems the only possibility. Getting thumped makes you realize when you shouldn't do certain things, basically. The story Benediction is another genre or subgenre of its own, one that Fitzgerald mines to similar effect, if you're familiar with both Absolution and the story Benediction. As Kirk has rightly pointed out, Benediction is, quote, the collection's best and yet for some reason most overlooked entry. Rudolph's certainty in that story that he has committed mortal sin manifests itself in Absolution in a wave of nausea and fear that envelops him as he awaits communion. And this moment in Absolution replicates Lois's experience during the sacrament of benediction. Benediction, if you're not familiar with it, I did have a Catholic upbringing, so I am familiar with it, but it's a kind of special hour, a holy hour spent just observing the host in this massive big relic kind of monstrance. It's like a big chalice-y kind of thing. It's quite the event, the veneration of this wafer. But there you go. It's a Catholic rite of adoration of the Holy Eucharist. Lois, in this moment of benediction, is overcome by the struggle between religious observance on the one hand, and this is deeply symbolized by her brother, who has chosen the life of a cloistered priest in a monastery, and it's located somewhere in eastern Maryland, outside Baltimore. She has the contradiction and the clash between that observance of religion and the realm of worldly experience that is given to and defined by sexual experience and expressions of physical love. Lois faints at this moment of benediction when she thinks she sees a flame within the monstrance and within the host, or thinks it's on fire, one or the other. And we're not quite sure if she sees it or not, and whether it's there or not to be seen, of course. But she faints during the benediction that gives the story its title. Benediction offers at least a two-way interpretation. It's the closing moment at the end of the Mass ceremony, a closing formal blessing, but it's also a moment of adoration or revelation. Lois then, in a discussion with her brother, she talks about the limits of her own religious exertions. Although he claims that you can't shock a monk, he's a professional shock absorber, which is one of the best lines in all of Fitzgerald's stories. Lois then instantly does shock him by mentioning birth control, speaking of a world of experience beyond both her brother's religious vocation and his moral understanding. Remember, Lois is openly discussing birth control in a 1920s story, 4 years after the opening of the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916 in Brooklyn by Elizabeth Sanger, and only 2 years after the quashing of the criminal conviction of Sanger for distributing contraception. The New York State Court of Appeals ruled that the state's 1916 ruling on Sanger was unconstitutional because it infringed upon women's liberty to choose how many children they might wish to have. It would be the following year, 1921, that Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, the precursor organization to Planned Parenthood. So Fitzgerald was willing and able to introduce and examine contentious issues in his fictions right from the very start of his career. A 23-year-old author keen to break the mold and the conservative orthodoxies of his own Catholic upbringing. Like James Joyce across the Atlantic Ocean had demonstrated in his story collection Dubliners from 1914 and a portrait of the artist as a young man 2 years later, butting against the Catholic grain was becoming more of a possibility, arguably even a necessity, in the fiction of a new generation of writers. This is not to say that Fitzgerald entered in the literary fray at the peak of his powers. Not at all. Indeed, there's a fair argument to be made that This Side of Paradise is his weakest novel. Certainly when compared to his later fictions, it now strikes us as an imperfect achievement. There's little controversy, I think, in saying that. Aside from the lists of typographical errors that only spotted after the first edition was published, and Fitzgerald attempted to correct these over the summer of 1920, sending lists of corrections to Maxwell Perkins, there are other issues about how the individual parts of the book meld into a unified, coherent whole. In addition, there are continuity errors, such as Eleanor at one point remarks on Amory's blonde hair, when in fact we've been told he has auburn hair. This was a slip between the original draft of The Romantic Egotist, in which the central character Stephen Pams did have blonde hair. Yet, despite it being a book that has its seams showing, as it were, a book that possibly attempts too much within its pages, that overdoes its experimenting with genres, we forgive its lapses because we cannot forget its style. We cannot forget its energy, or the verve of Fitzgerald's writing. His prose at the start of the novel's final chapter offers readers a prelude of what is to come in the pristine descriptions that would elevate The Great Gatsby, for example, from being a book that is otherwise about an assortment of unscrupulous opportunists and gangsters, as well as offering a huge body count. After citing a 16-line poem, the chapter "The Egotist Becomes a Personage" opens, "Under the glass porte cochere of a theatre, Amory stood, watching the first great drops of rain splatter down and flatten to dark stains on the sidewalk. The air became grey and opalescent. The solitary light suddenly outlined a window over the way, then another light, then 100 more danced and glimmered into vision. Under his feet, a thick iron-studded skylight turned yellow. In the street, the lamps of the taxicab sent out glistening sheens along the already black pavement. The unwelcome November rain had perversely stolen the day's last hour and pawned it with that ancient fence, the night. The silence of the theatre behind him ended with a curious snapping sound, followed by the heavy roaring of a rising crowd and the interlaced clatter of many voices. The matinee was over." A number of things are indeed over by this stage of the novel, principal among them Amory's adventures under the title of Egotist. The previous chapter had concluded with a number of connected losses for Amory. The unseemly events in an Atlantic City hotel, which make the New York newspapers, directly below the announcement of the society wedding of Rosalind Comage to Dawson Ryder. There's also the fact that his mother's poor investments in streetcar companies will yield no income, and the final coup de grace news of Monsignor Darcy's sudden death. Amory's matinee is indeed over, his hour upon the stage now almost past, and the dramas of the earlier sections of the book, quite literally drama, in the debutante chapter, give way to a solemn melancholia that releases Amory into a mood of detached estrangement from the city and its citizens that had previously offered such high entertainments. He pictured the rooms where these people lived, where the patterns of the blistered wallpapers were heavy, reiterated sunflowers on green and yellow backgrounds, where there were tin bathtubs and gloomy hallways and verdureless, unnameable spaces in back of the buildings, where even love dressed as seduction, a sordid murder around the corner, illicit motherhood in the flat above. And always there was the economical stuffiness of indoor winter and the long summers, nightmares of perspiration between sticky, enveloping walls. Dirty restaurants where careless, tired people helped themselves to sugar with their own used coffee spoons, leaving hard brown deposits in the bowl. It's little wonder, perhaps, looking back, that the title of the Chicago Daily News review of this side of paradise declared, "Phew, how that boy can write." Such a judgment reflected a perceived correlation between Fitzgerald's style and advertisements. Well, he was briefly an advertising man after all, before he got to finish writing this novel. But the lasting power of his work is not its ephemeral nature, quite the opposite. Fitzgerald's control of language and his orchestration of his descriptions, even at this early stage in his writing, is one of the reasons why he holds the elevated place that he does today in the United States and across the world. Where the novel can be judged less successful is in some of its rather forced set-piece dialogues that are included, it would appear, to make specific points about any given subject. Invariably, they involve two characters, Amory Blaine plus one other, in occasionally stilted debates about the merits of literature, or the rise of socialism, or the differences between the sexes. Fitzgerald's deployment of dialogue would improve significantly, I think, in the later works, but it's not to say that these episodes should be overlooked entirely. Indeed, in the Experiments in Convalescence chapter of Book 2, Amory and Tom D'Invilliers have a heated exchange concerning the power of newspapers and of the political machinations of powerful media moguls, that is, when considered in the light of our social media manipulations of the second decade of the 21st century, and the attendant concerns over alternative facts and fake news, both prescient in its observations and its consequences. In the peripheries of the novel, references are made to leading media men of the day, such as Clarence Mackay, who was president of the Mackay Radio and Telegraph Company, and William Randolph Hearst, arguably the era's most influential shaper of public opinion, given the size and reach of his media empire. So Fitzgerald was aware of the control and possible manipulation available to powerful media organizations. He was also attuned to the benefits of positive coverage in the print media, and increasingly, the opportunities made available to an author like himself of moving image media. It is telling then that Amory reserves a particularly excoriating commentary for newspapers on the effect that a conservative and reactionary approach can have on the populace. Any rich, unprogressive old party with that particularly grasping, acquisitive form of mentality known as financial genius can own a paper that is the intellectual meat and drink of thousands of tired, hurried men too involved in the business of modern living to swallow anything but pre-digested food. A year later, there is a new political ring or a change in the paper's ownership. Consequence, more confusion, more contradiction, a sudden inrush of new ideas, their tempering, their distillation, reaction against them. His dissection here of the news cycle, of the vested money interests behind the scenes making a profit from maintaining their social and particularly their financial status quo, and the passive role of the modern public, is a telling indictment of the truth or otherwise of what is served up as reading matter. A few lines later, he refuses to participate personally in this kind of charade, having quite enough sins on my soul without putting dangerous, shallow epigrams into people's heads. Sound familiar? For readers today, 100 years on from such observations, the parallel with more recent political upheavals on both sides of the Atlantic strikes home, doing so with renewed and pointed force. While times may change, the underlying motivations of human beings change little. Fitzgerald was alert to this throughout his writing, and this assisted his creation of fictions and characters that transcend their particular historical moment. These are some of the reasons why Fitzgerald remains current, why revisiting a novel such as The Side of Paradise brings with it significant merits, and what perhaps, finally, explains why this novel, somehow marking 100 years, refuses to grow or be old. I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention today. Sitting through a lecture of this length is never easy at the best of times, but on screen is a whole different thing as well. So thank you very much for that. And happy 124th birthday, Scott Fitzgerald. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Philip. That was fascinating. I'm particularly taken by the resonance that you were diving into between the short stories and the novel. So I hope that some of our attendees will have some questions or comments about that. It is now time to open it up for questions. And I have to say a side note here too, Philip. I really wish that we had had you in person. I was sitting in my room, in my spare bedroom, chuckling. And I was really wishing that you could hear our reactions to some of your witticisms. So thank you for that.
Another time.
I do have just a question to kick us off. And because, you know, we are based in St. Paul, it's a bit of a St. Paul question.
Yeah.
You know, so This Side of Paradise, as you've talked about, was really a turning point for Fitzgerald. And it also marks really when he leaves Minnesota. I do believe he comes back again, maybe in 1921. I might be off on that, but I think it is a departure point from his home.
Mm-hmm.
And would you be able to talk to us just a little bit generally about the pre-Paradise Fitzgerald and the post-Paradise Fitzgerald?
Well, one of the things that after he has dropped out of Princeton and he's doing his army training in various places around the Midwest and the American South, and he's working on the Romantic Egotist, all Fitzgerald's attention is turned east. You know, he's thinking about going to war. He's thinking about fighting for his country and all of the glory and maybe disaster that might bring. And then his attention turns to Montgomery, Alabama because of Zelda. He doesn't get to fight in the war, so he's kind of frustrated on that count. But you know, the time pressure that he had in relation to maybe dying because of international conflict is changed to a time pressure about, well, if I don't write this book that I promised this beautiful young 18-year-old, 19-year-old woman, then I'm not going to get her. So immediately when he is decommissioned from the army, he works for an advertising company in New York for about 5 months, not very successfully. Meanwhile, Scribner's has looked at versions of the novel and new drafts and have rejected it twice. So he decides to go back to St. Paul, and he works on what would become This Side of Paradise in the final draft. So in some ways, you know, he needed to go back and to, you know, live with his parents and to concentrate on writing the text in a way that he didn't have the ability to do beforehand because of the army training, because of Zelda, because of a kind of, you know, transient lifestyle in New York and the eastern states and down to Alabama. So Montgomery at that point allows him, St. Paul, allows him the opportunity to finish the novel. But then, yeah, it does kind of signal his break from that and from that area. And it's interesting, you know, how Amory in the novel also makes that break, you know, with the background of the Blaines and moving, you know, to Princeton and then, you know, constantly looking east. The difference for Amory is that he does get to go to war, and, you know, he has that slightly different experience from Fitzgerald that is concentrated obviously on the Eastern Seaboard and Manhattan, New York, Atlantic City. The Midwest and all of that would be held over for another time. It doesn't disappear from the Fitzgerald imaginary, but it's something that he is, I suppose, consciously moving away from to insert himself into a literary society in New York. Once this book comes out and once Flappers and Philosophers comes out. I don't have Kirk's edition here. Sorry, Kirk, if you're watching. So I don't know if that quite helps.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. No, I appreciate that kind of overview. We are starting to get some questions in from our audience, and one of them, I've got a question about the stories in Flappers and Philosophers and which you think are particularly resonant and relevant to the 21st century reader. And on the flip side of that, which of them to you seems more comically dated?
Oh, you see, this is where I hang myself. Thank you, everyone. I think The Cut Glass Bowl is amazing. It's a great story. I used to teach Bernice Bobs her hair, and I don't think I would again because it is quite light, let's say, but it is supposed to be humorous. Like these are funny stories for the main. I think that if one that talks to the 21st century, well, The Ice Palace is timeless. I think it's such a good story. It'd be one that I would always recommend going to probably first in Flappers and Philosophers. But I do think I reread Benediction today, and I was struck again by how prescient and how modern that, like contemporary, modern, 21st century, that story feels. And Lois's rebellion, we're not quite sure exactly what happens. She doesn't go back to Howard, who she sent a telegram to at the start. Then she sees her brother. Then she sends another telegram, which suggests, you know, it's over. I would suggest going to Italy. And you know, that's quite a striking thing for that character to do, and it's quite an odd story in so many ways. So I think if I was to rate them rather than Fitzgerald's rating, I would go with The Ice Palace and Benediction, two stories that are pretty current and timeless. The Four Fists, oh, really? Like, you know, he shouldn't, I don't think he should have. He could have edited that one out, but that's my opinion.
Thank you. So we do have a question from Kirk Kernut, who was listening, but I don't think offended that you didn't pick up his book. But he's got some questions that dive really into some details of this side of paradise, and is wondering your opinion on two scenes. You might be able to read this here too, but the supercilious sacrifice scene where Amory takes the blame for breaking the Mann Act to cover for Rosalind's brother, Alec, and the conversation with Mr. Ferrenby and his assistant toward the end. And how do you think those help develop his character? He seems profoundly ambivalent about both moments.
I think ambivalent is a great word there, actually. You know, he's trying on the ideas of socialism with that second conversation with Ferrenby and the associate, the guy with the goggles and the glasses in the car. And he, you know, it's a bit like that section I quoted about the media as well, that he's just kind of trying out and road testing a few ideas about, you know, what it would be to be socialist, what it would be to resist capitalism, what it would be to be, I suppose, the hero in the Atlantic City hotel scene where he saves his friend, who then is no longer his friend. He saves his bacon and the respectability or not of the woman involved. You know, I think the interesting thing is how these things just get dropped. You know, in a later Fitzgerald fiction or in another writer's hands, these would be key moments in the character development, but they just disappear. And I think that's part of the sort of disconnected nature of the book. You know, his mother, Beatrice Blaine, dies in a sentence in the middle of the war. It's just a reference to it. You're like, hold on, isn't that a little bit more important? Hasn't she taken up some of the best comic scenes in Fitzgerald's writing at the start of the novel? Like, she's a hugely important and hilarious character, and then she's just gone. Same with Monsignor Darcy. So there is a sense, I think, of this book of Fitzgerald getting these different scenes and then just sort of pushing them together and go, well, that kind of makes a book. What do you think? And he kind of gets away with it because the writing is vibrant and challenging of a kind of set of social ideas and decorum of the moment. But in terms of character development, you know, I don't know what we're supposed to think of Amory, because we start off thinking he's kind of humorous, sardonic, intellectual, but not really, socialist, but not at all, heroic, but never. So, you know, I don't think character development works in this novel. You know, if I was to really tear it apart, I think that's probably what I would alight on. I would say, actually, you know, this is not the deeply psychological engagement with character that we get in this side of, or in Tenders of the Night. You know, that's a much more complex investigation into how individual Fitzgerald characters are positioning themselves in the world and how they might have an arc, as we would say today. Whereas Amory just seems to be a set of individual scenes.
Mm. Since you brought her up, I'm curious about Beatrice Blaine and to what extent you think that Amory and Beatrice's relationship was a reflection of or a mirror of the relationship that Fitzgerald had with his own mother, Molly McQuillan Fitzgerald.
Good question. I don't think there's an awful lot of comparison there. Fitzgerald was, to use again Kirk's word there, ambivalent about his heritage and about his connection with his mother, who was somewhat overweening at times. I'm not sure he called his mother by her first name. No evidence that he did or didn't, but I'm surprised if he did. Whereas Beatrice and Amory call themselves by their first names and are on very close, not intimate close, but close terms. And they have this very odd relationship, in which, you know, she just, you know, is dismayed about all the things that have been done to her, but she's also part of the, you know, the novel's depiction of Amory's development as coming out of this kind of almost nonsensical hilarity family situation where, you know, they've got no money, but she lives beyond her means. You know, I've been watching a lot of Schitt's Creek, and I can't help but think of Moira being Beatrice Blaine. You know, it's just so, they're so alike, which I don't think Molly McQuillan Fitzgerald was.
Mhm. Great. So we've got a question here that delves a little bit more into your research and wondering any more interesting historical connections that you discovered in your research. And just a tidbit that this comes from a fellow editor who's going to be working on The Beautiful and the Damned. Do you have any tips?
Well, you know, and this is where Kirk and I sort of hold our amazing alacrity in getting these things done. I only had 5 months, so I didn't get an awful lot of time. What I decided to do was to take Jack's edition, because that's the one that came, or yeah, Oxford sent me, so not Cambridge. And I took Jim's edition because it's the edition. And then I just rooted around with some of the historical facts. So I just by chance came across that Knickerbocker Hotel bar thing, and I think there's a problem there, and I couldn't resist. And there's another one about a geographical location for a restaurant, which is not accurate in the Cambridge edition. Sorry, Jim. But you know, so those kind of things I was quite interested. You know, had I had more time, more than 5 months, then I probably would have done a lot more digging into those things and looking at, you know, so newspaper articles of the time and the music of the period, and you know, what Fitzgerald is working off, because he was great at absorbing all of the popular culture of his moment and then redistilling it back into his fiction. So his interest in music, his interest in popular culture, his interest in history. This novel, I suppose, is tipped a bit more towards literary endeavors, and he packs in way too many references to other authors. And I don't know whether we're supposed to be impressed by this, but after a while, like I did read a review of this edition, which said that the notes were quite long, my edition, and they're quite long for a reason, because there's a lot of stuff that he refers to. And so I think, you know, for The Beautiful and Damned that you're doing, Bill, I think you've got a little bit more time to do some of that historical stuff and bring it to the fore. It is quite interesting how Fitzgerald positions himself and his characters in relation to history. From that moment, from the war into Prohibition, but also into the Roaring Twenties, and then up into the Depression. You know, there is a historical narrative playing itself out in the background of Fitzgerald's text, and he always has an eye on it. You know, any sense that Fitzgerald is not connected to his time, or he's some sort of producer of superfluous fictions, is totally wrong. He's got an eye concentrated on the moment, the historical moment, and the importance of that. And we see that in Tender as the Night with the whole Psalm sequence, for example, which is devastating and although wrong in that he doesn't think it's going to happen again.
So we have an attendee who's curious, and I am as well. What was your first encounter with Fitzgerald's literature? How did you move from there to where we are all today? Listening to you.
A-levels, my A-levels in high school, The Great Gatsby was on, and still is on, the curriculum. So I find myself trotted out to go to schools here to talk about The Great Gatsby, which is hilarious. And I always start, and no one thinks it's funny because they look at this old man at the front going, what's he talking about for? But I did Gatsby in school, and it just kind of stuck. Fitzgerald kind of stuck. That and Wuthering Heights were my two favorite novels, and so I was kind of this desperate romantic who then went on to do a PhD, and Fitzgerald featured prominently in that. And then by luck and happenstance, when Ruth Pergozzi was still around, I went to the Fitzgerald conference in Nice in 2000. Oh my God, what a conference. Oh my God, there'll never be a better conference. It was so good. And if you've never been to a Fitzgerald Society conference, I'm sure most people looking at that, I'm looking at Bill, I'm looking at Deborah, I'm looking at Donnie, you know, but if you haven't been and you're watching this, get yourselves to the next one. Right? Next year's one will probably be online, but 2023 could be interesting in Europe if we find, and what's the word I'm looking for? Guarantee maybe the destination. And then 2025, there's going to be a big conference, Fitzgerald in America, celebrating the centenary of Gatsby. So, you know, if you've never been to a Fitzgerald Society thing, you should go, because then you'll never have Fitzgerald away from you, because you'll always be thinking about Escott Fitzgerald all the time. Yes, A-levels. A-levels when I was 16, 17, I started reading Fitzgerald.
Right.
I reread Gatsby this morning for the proofs for the Penguin edition. It must be the 90th time I've read that novel.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Do you, well, so after you've just said that you've read Gatsby 90 times, maybe I already know the answer to this question, but since you brought in Flappers and Philosophers and that anniversary in this discussion with This Side of Paradise, thinking of Fitzgerald as both thinking of Fitzgerald as both a short story writer and a novelist, what do you see as his strengths in one or the other? If we forced you right now to pick, do you think he's a stronger short story writer or a novelist? Would you be able to do it, or do they play off each other in such a way that you can't really choose?
If we were there in person, this is where I would turn about on my heel and get another glass of wine. So, you know, it depends what you mean by successful, Elaine. In some ways, the short story fiction kind of bankrolled a lot of Fitzgerald's life. He was making a lot of money from that, and it helped support the lifestyle and the hospitalizations for Zelda. So, you know, it was successful for what it needed to be. But I think, you know, the novels are stronger. There's an awful lot more in them. I think Tender as the Night is one of the most heartbreaking, amazing books that I've read. The Love of the Last Tycoon could have been just amazing. Even what we have of it is fantastic. I think Gatsby gets too much credit. Oops. It's good. It's good. It's great. It's lovely. But, you know, I think, you know, that's why I was like, when I went back to this and I got to read this again, I was kind of kicking myself and God, there's a lot more in this novel than I gave it credit for. And I did sort of plow through it the very first time I read it, and it was a bit episodic, and it's a bit like different stories put together, which it is, and like short bits of short stories and bits of drama that he'd written just stuck together to get anything published. So it doesn't quite hold together, but I do think his novels are better. That said, a lot of the short stories, not the Four Fists, but a lot of the short stories are so good. Like, they're so good that had I written even one paragraph of them, I would never write anything again. The Ice Palace is fantastic. The Lost Decade is a great story. Babylon Revisited is just amazing. So, yeah, it's hard. Depends on how you define success. But I think the novels are the thing, with some brilliant stories around. There's some really weak stories that he just churned out for the cash. But that's, why not? He was aware of that. It's not as if he wasn't aware of it. You know, he was aware.
Yeah. Well, I have one more. It feels like as we're wrapping up, bring it back to This Side of Paradise, and I've got another question. You talked a little bit about the reception of it, and certainly the sales of This Side of Paradise were very strong. Do you know, or can you talk to us a little bit about how critics responded specifically to some of those edgier aspects that you talked about? You know, the strong college women, the elements of social critique, and critique of religion.
At the time, those were not the coordinates, let's say, that the critics would have focused on. I think they're looking more at the idea of the style of writing, and they give Fitzgerald a lot of credit for being able to produce this kind of writing that just blows everything away. For the time, the edgier aspect, yes, they were certainly edgier. Donny, yes, it is. I think, you know, he trod a fine line between morality and not quite immorality, but he trod a fine line between morality and its discontent in This Side of Paradise. And, you know, he shows people not quite having sex, but the prelude to sex, and that's, whoa, you know, it's like, Jesus. You know, so there's like heavy petting, there's kissing, there's things in hotel rooms, and in a lot of the occasions, it's women who are, wanting to take control of these situations. Amory is he's a bit of a sap, really. He's one of those kind of people, if you're your friend, you go, look, I'll ask her out for you if you want at the start. It gets better. But it's interesting that it's the women who they're all formidable. Rosalind is, fated and maybe the one. His mother is really formidable. Eleanor Savage is clearly the one that maybe, there's most in common with, because she has the whole sort of Poe thing going on, and she's got all her literary references. And she's, completely upfront about being a forward-thinking feminist. So that's what I would say. That was a flash of lightning. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh no. Well, I think that we should give Stu Wilson, who has the credit of bringing us together, with the last question here. You on one side of the Atlantic and we on the other side. Do you think that Europeans view Fitzgerald differently than Americans? Big final question.
Do Minnesotans consider Fitzgerald differently from Europe? Probably. Fitzgerald here, it's interesting, he wasn't that successful here, certainly not during his lifetime, and it was only with the industry that came after The Love of the Last Tycoon was reissued with Gatsby, and then stories started happening, and Fitzgerald's popularity starts to climb in the 50s and 60s. But it wouldn't really be, until much more recently that people in Europe, I wouldn't say venerate Fitzgerald necessarily, but, I think he's a bit, I don't know whether this is true in America or not, but here he's still a bit of a Marmite writer. You either love him or you hate him. Some people really hate F. Scott Fitzgerald, and they shrug, like, oh, suppose you like Hemingway as well. Like, maybe. Yeah, but then it has to be Faulkner, or it has to be Edith Wharton. And you know what? They're all, well, so Hemingway, but they're all good. They're all very, very good. People, I think maybe because it is on our high school syllabus here, and if you do A-levels and leaving certs in Ireland and Scottish hires and stuff, that if you don't like Gatsby at 17, you're never going to like Fitzgerald. So some people who, plodded through The Great Gatsby at school, who hate Fitzgerald, and fair enough, I hate Midsummer Night's Dream.
Well, maybe we have an opportunity with the centennial coming up in a few years and your new edition to change some minds around Gatsby and Fitzgerald. Philip, I want to thank you so very much. This has been wonderful. And to everyone out there in the ether, thank you for being a part of this special celebration of Fitzgerald's birthday.
Comments all the time.
So we're very grateful as well to Baird for sponsoring all of our Fitzgerald programming. And I'm going to close with a way you can support the St. Paul Public Library, and that is by attending our virtual gala, Opus and Olives. We know that Fitzgerald is somewhat infamous for his thoughts and comments about the library and the value of libraries, but we think a little bit differently, or at least our view is more expansive. So you can check out our website at www.thefriends.org, and you can see our gala, which is going to support the work of the library and the Friends. You get to enjoy some fantastic contemporary authors and be in community with others who value the library as well. So that's my final plug. Thank you all very, very much. Again, thank you so much, Philip. I hope that the weather clears for you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day, perhaps raising a glass to F. Scott Fitzgerald and his amazing legacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.